When my daughter found out I was moving to a small province in the Philippines, she didn't say a word for almost a full minute. Then she asked me if I had talked to a doctor recently. I was 67 years old, widowed, living on a fixed income that covered my bills but not much else. And I had just told her I was selling most of what I owned, packing 2 bags, and moving to a country I had visited exactly once, for 8 days, 4 years earlier. My son-in-law thought it was grief. He pulled my daughter aside in the kitchen. He didn't know I could hear him, and said quietly that maybe this was just how some people process losing a spouse, that I'd come around eventually, that they should give me time. My buddy Ed, who I'd known since we worked the same floor at the warehouse back in the late 90s, told me straight to my face that he thought I was having some kind of episode. Not meanly, the way an old friend says something because he's worried and doesn't know how else to put it. He said, "You're 67, Vince. You're not 30. What are you trying to prove?" I understood why all of them felt that way. I really did. If the roles had been reversed, I probably would have said the same things. But what none of them understood was that I wasn't running from something. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't chasing some version of my younger self around the Pacific. I was trying to solve a problem. A very specific, very real problem that had been quietly building for years. And over the 18 months that followed, living in a small city in the province, I learned 8 things that changed how I thought about money, about getting older, about what I actually needed to be content, and about the kind of life I still had ahead of me. The last one surprised me more than anything. But first, let me explain what the problem actually was. My wife Carol passed away 3 years before I made the move. 29 years of marriage. The grief was real and it was long, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't part of what put me in motion. But grief alone wasn't the reason I left. If anything, the grief was what finally made me honest with myself about something I'd been avoiding for a long time, the finances. I wasn't broke. I want to be clear about that. I had Social Security coming in, just over $1,400 a month. I had a small pension from the company I'd worked at for 22 years before the plant closed. Between the two, I was bringing in around $1,900 most months. In a lot of parts of the world, that's a decent income. In the mid-size Ohio city, where I'd lived most of my adult life, it was enough to keep the lights on and not much else. The house had been paid off, mostly. But property taxes had climbed steadily for years. Insurance kept going up. The furnace needed replacing 2 winters before Carol died. The roof had a section that a contractor told me was going to need attention within the next 2 or 3 years, which in my budget translated to a crisis I couldn't see my way around. Groceries, utilities, a car that was getting older, none of it was dramatic on its own. But every month, something seemed to find a way to cost a little more than the month before. And when you're on a fixed income, every increase feels personal. You can't work more hours. You can't ask for a raise. The numbers are the numbers. What really got to me, and I think this is the part a lot of retirees understand, but don't talk about enough, wasn't the money itself. It was the feeling. The feeling that after 43 years of working, of paying into the system, of doing everything I was supposed to do, retirement had somehow turned into a second job. A job where the task was just managing the slow decline of a budget that couldn't keep up. One evening in February, about a year after Carol passed, I was sitting at the kitchen table going through the bills. Nothing unusual, no emergency. Just the regular stack of envelopes that showed up every month, and I caught myself thinking something I hadn't expected. I was more anxious sitting there than I ever remembered feeling when I was still punching a clock. At least, when I was working, I felt like I had some control. If something went wrong, I could pick up overtime. I could figure something out. Now the options felt like they were just narrowing, a little more each year, whether I did anything or not. That was the night I started asking questions I'd been avoiding. The research took months. I'm not someone who makes fast decisions. I watched videos, read forums, compared costs, looked at a lot of different countries. My son-in-law, to his credit, helped me build a spreadsheet. He thought it would talk me out of the idea. Instead, one place kept coming back to the top of every calculation I ran: the Philippines. The cost of living was lower than I had expected. People spoke English. The climate was warm year-round. And something else kept showing up in the accounts of Americans who had actually done it. Not just a financial thing, but something harder to put into words. People said they felt better, not just more comfortable financially. Actually better. I thought they were talking about the weather. I was wrong. The first thing I learned had nothing to do with money. It had to do with risk. For months after I started seriously considering the move, I kept a running list in my head of all the reasons it was a bad idea. I was too old. I didn't know the country well enough. What if my health got worse? What if I needed to come back quickly? What if I made a serious mistake from which there was no easy recovery? That list was long and I took it seriously. But there was another question I wasn't asking, and it only came into focus one afternoon while I was looking at my bank statement for the third time that week. What if staying was also a risk? What if the slow financial erosion I was already experiencing was itself a kind of danger, just a quieter one? The risks of moving felt visible and dramatic. The risks of staying were invisible and gradual. But invisible doesn't mean absent. That realization, that staying put is also a choice, and choices have consequences, was the first thing that actually shifted something in my thinking. The second thing I learned showed up about 2 months after I arrived in the province. I had settled into a small city called General Santos in the southern part of the country. The rent for a clean, furnished apartment was $380 a month. Groceries ran about $120. Utilities, transportation, the occasional meal out. My total monthly expenses were landing somewhere between $850 and $950, depending on the month. After years of financial tightening, I suddenly had breathing room I hadn't felt in a long time, and I expected that to feel like relief. What I didn't expect was how long it took to actually feel it. The first 2 months, my brain was still running the old software. I was still waking up at night running mental calculations, still bracing for the next unexpected expense, still treating every purchase like a potential setback. Moving hadn't automatically turned off the anxiety that had been building for years. That's not how it works. But then one evening, maybe 10 weeks in, I was sitting outside on the small porch of my apartment. The sun was going down. A couple of neighborhood kids were kicking a ball around in the street. Somebody nearby was cooking. I could smell it. And a few of the older men from the building were sitting on plastic chairs a little way down, talking about something I couldn't quite follow. Nothing was happening. Nothing important, anyway, and I realized my mind was quiet. Not bored, not distracted. Just quiet. I wasn't thinking about what needed fixing or paying or planning. I was sitting there watching the end of an ordinary day and actually noticing it. That sounds like a small thing. For me, it was the biggest change I'd experienced in years. Bigger than the lower rent. Bigger than the money I was saving. Because I hadn't realized, until that moment on the porch, how loud the background noise had been. How long I'd been carrying a kind of low-level pressure that I'd stopped noticing because it had become so constant. And now, for the first time in a very long time, it was gone. The third thing I learned was about loneliness. This one caught me off guard. When people think about retirement abroad, the conversation is almost always financial. Cost of living, exchange rates, pension stretching. What nobody mentioned to me, and maybe because it's not a comfortable thing to admit, is how quietly lonely life can become after you stop working. I had friends back home, a good relationship with my daughter and my son-in-law. I talked to my son on the phone a couple times a month, but the daily texture of connection, the kind you don't even notice until it's gone. The morning coffee with somebody, the quick conversation in a hallway, the simple fact of being around other people, that had been fading for years. After Carol died, it faded even faster. What surprised me in General Santos was how hard it became to stay isolated if I'd wanted to. A woman who ran the small convenience store near my apartment started greeting me by name within the first week. The man who lived 2 doors down knocked on my door on my third evening there to bring me a plate of food his wife had made. He explained, very matter-of-factly, that she always cooked too much. This happened again the following week, and the week after that. Before a month was up, I knew the names of most of the people in my building and a handful from the street. I hadn't managed that in my old neighborhood in 15 years. That kind of connection, informal, frequent, unremarkable to the people doing it, turned out to matter more than I would have predicted. I'm not saying I wasn't also lonely sometimes. I'm not going to pretend the move solved everything. But there's a difference between sometimes feeling lonely and living in the kind of low-grade isolation that becomes invisible because it's been your normal for so long. That difference took me a while to name. Once I could name it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The fourth thing I learned was about asking for help. I grew up in a generation and a culture where you figured things out on your own. That's just what you did. You didn't ask unless you absolutely had to, and even then you felt some version of embarrassed about it. Moving to a new country at 67 put that habit under pressure pretty quickly. I didn't know where things were. I didn't understand the local systems. I needed help with things I would have handled alone back home without a second thought. And the first few times I had to ask for assistance from a neighbor or a shop owner or someone on the street, I braced for the kind of mild impatience I'd grown used to. The look that says you're wasting someone's time, that's not what I found. People helped, not reluctantly, not as a transaction. They helped the way you help someone when it doesn't occur to you not to. My neighbor's teenage son spent an afternoon showing me how to navigate the local jeepney routes when I told him I was trying to get to the market without a car. He didn't ask for anything. His mother seemed almost puzzled when I tried to thank her for sending him. She said something that I've thought about a lot since. She said, loosely translated, "We're neighbors." Of course, I'd spent the better part of 40 years believing that needing help was something to minimize. That self-sufficiency was a form of dignity. I still think there's something to that. But I've also come to think that refusing help when you genuinely need it, or worse, being too proud to admit you need it, isn't dignity at all. It's just stubbornness wearing dignity's clothes. The people I've come to respect most in my life, looking back, weren't the ones who never needed anything. They were the ones who gave help freely and received it without making a big production of either. The fifth thing I learned was the one I resisted the longest. I had to learn how to slow down, and I was, to put it plainly, terrible at it for quite a while. Back home, my days had always been organized around doing. Even in retirement. Get up, have coffee, handle the errands, fix the thing that needed fixing, make the calls, balance the accounts, stay on top of everything. There was always something on the list, and I kept the list because the list was how I stayed in control. Or at least that's what I told myself. In the province, time moves differently. Not worse, differently. An appointment at a certain time means something slightly more flexible than what that phrase implies in Ohio. A repair that will be done tomorrow can mean the day after, or sometimes the day after that. People take long lunches. Conversations don't get cut short because someone has somewhere to be. I found all of this genuinely maddening for the first several weeks. I remember one afternoon when I was waiting for a plumber, who was supposed to arrive in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon he hadn't shown up and hadn't called. I was pacing around my apartment building up a head of irritation that, looking back, was completely out of proportion to the situation. When he finally arrived, he was unhurried, apologetic in a relaxed kind of way that didn't include any visible distress about being late. He fixed the problem efficiently. Then he sat down and had a conversation with me about where I was from for about 20 minutes before he left. I'm still not sure what to make of that afternoon, except that by the end of it I was no longer irritated. Over time, something started to shift. I began sitting outside more in the evenings without a specific reason for being there. I stopped treating every moment as something to be optimized. I let conversations go longer than they needed to. I started walking places instead of rushing. And one afternoon, I realized I'd spent the better part of an hour watching a group of older men play cards in the shade near the market, and I hadn't once checked my phone or thought about what I was supposed to be doing instead. That felt strange. Then it felt good. Then it just felt normal. I've thought a lot about why slowing down was so hard for me. Part of it is personality. Part of it is probably generational. A lot of men my age were raised to equate productivity with value. But part of it, I think, was that staying busy had become a way of managing the anxiety I talked about earlier. If I was always doing something, I didn't have to sit still with the discomfort. Moving here forced me to sit still whether I wanted to or not. And eventually, sitting still stopped feeling like a failure. The sixth thing I learned was one that still embarrasses me a little to admit. I had been wrong about what happiness required. For most of my life, I operated on a simple assumption. More comfort means more happiness, bigger house, newer car, more saved, more stable, and therefore more at ease. There's some truth in that, obviously. Basic security matters enormously. Anyone who's lived without it knows that. But I'd taken the principle further than it actually holds. I'd convinced myself that if I could just get to a certain level of financial stability, a certain size of house, a certain number in the savings account, then the contentment would follow naturally. It would arrive like a delivery I'd been waiting for. When Carol and I got the house, I thought that was the delivery. When we paid it off, I thought that was it again. When I retired with the pension, I thought, this is it, now I can relax. But the delivery kept getting deferred. There was always the next thing that needed to be secured before I could really settle in. Here's what I noticed in General Santos. I was living in a space about a third the size of my house back home. I owned a fraction of what I'd owned before. I had one set of good dishes and a coffee maker and the things I needed and not much more. And I was more at ease than I had been in years. Not because deprivation is virtuous, but because it turned out that most of what I'd been maintaining, the extra rooms, the garage full of things I used twice a year, the obligations that came with owning more than you need, had been quietly costing me in ways I never counted. Time, energy, mental space. The happiness I'd been deferring to some future state of comfort had actually been available all along. In a much simpler version of my life. I just hadn't been willing to look at it. The seventh thing I learned took me the longest to put into words. I had to change what I thought success meant. Back home, the definition had felt obvious. A good career, a house that was paid for, a retirement account, even if mine was smaller than I'd planned. Raising 2 kids who turned out well, staying married. Those were the markers, and I had most of them. But I also noticed, now that I had some distance from the life I'd been living, that I'd spent a lot of years measuring myself against those markers and finding myself slightly short. Not a failure. I wasn't hard on myself in that way. Just always aware of the gap between where I was and where I thought I was supposed to be. Living in the province changed my frame of reference in a way I hadn't anticipated. The people I got to know there were not, by any American standard, wealthy. Many of them worked hard at jobs that paid a fraction of what similar work would earn in the States. They lived modestly. They didn't have a lot by the measures I'd been using my whole life, and yet there was something in the daily texture of their lives, the ease of laughter, the way time with family seemed central and not squeezed into a corner, the apparent absence of the constant low-grade striving I recognized from my own former life that stopped me cold. It wasn't that they were happier because they had less. That's too simple, and I don't believe it. What I think is more accurate is that they had defined what was enough, and they were living within that definition. They weren't perpetually chasing a version of their life that was always slightly out of reach. They had enough food, enough connection, enough reason to get up in the morning. And somewhere in watching that, I started asking a different question. Not how do I get more, but what actually constitutes enough for me? That question rewired something. I stopped measuring my retirement by what I lacked and started paying attention to what was already present. A morning coffee I could afford without anxiety. A walk through the market without a list in my head of what I couldn't buy. An evening on the porch with a cold drink and no particular place I needed to be. None of that is dramatic. But drama isn't the same thing as value. The eighth thing I learned was the one I didn't see coming. It happened about a year into the move, during a phone call with my daughter. She'd been cautious about the whole thing from the beginning, but she'd softened as the months passed. I was clearly not having an episode. I was clearly not wasting away. In fact, during that call, she said something that caught me off guard. She said, "Dad, you sound different, like yourself, but lighter." I thought about that word for a long time afterward. Lighter. I think what she was noticing wasn't a change in my situation. It was a change in the way I was carrying my situation. For most of my adult life, I'd been oriented toward the future. Everything was preparation. Work now so you can save. Save now so you can retire. Retire and then? What exactly? For decades, the answer to "and then" had been vague. Something better. Something easier. Some future version of life that was going to be the payoff for all the preparation. What I hadn't realized, what I think a lot of people don't realize until they're standing somewhere unexpected at 67 years old, thousands of miles from where they grew up, is that the orientation toward the future can become its own kind of prison. Not a bad life. Not an unhappy one. Just a perpetually deferred one. Always almost there. Always getting ready for the real thing. Moving to the province didn't solve that problem, but it interrupted it long enough for me to see it. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't preparing for the next phase. I was in a phase, fully, and I was living it, not managing it, not enduring it, living it. And once I noticed that, I couldn't unfeel it. My daughter flew out to visit me 9 months after I moved. I was nervous about it, honestly. I wanted her to understand, and I wasn't sure she would. What I hadn't counted on was how much she would enjoy it. My son-in-law came too. The 4 of us. They'd brought their youngest, my 6-year-old grandson Marcus, spent 10 days together. We went to the market and ate things none of us could name with confidence. We took a boat out to an island about an hour offshore. We watched Marcus spend an entire afternoon completely absorbed in playing with the kids from my building, none of them sharing a language, all of them having more fun than I'd seen him have in a long time. On the last evening, my daughter and I sat out on the porch after the others had gone to bed. She was quiet for a while. Then she said she finally understood what I'd been trying to explain. Not the money part, she'd understood that for a while. The other part, the part about how it felt. She asked me if I had any regrets. I told her the honest answer, which is that I have some. I miss the changing seasons more than I expected. I miss driving my own car. I miss Ed and the other friends I've drifted from more than I let on in most conversations. There are things I left behind that mattered to me, and leaving them was a real loss, not just a footnote. But do I regret the decision itself? No, not even close. Here's what I actually found in the province, and it wasn't what I went looking for. I went looking for a budget that worked. What I found instead was something harder to budget for, a version of my days that felt worth showing up to. Not a version that was perfect, not a version without frustration or loneliness or bad weeks, but a version that had breathing room in it. Space to be a person instead of a manager of problems. Space to notice things. Space to have an actual conversation. Space to sit on a porch at the end of the day and feel like the day was worth something. Not because I accomplished a list, but because I was actually present for it. I'll tell you the thing I think about most now, when I'm sitting out in the evenings and watching the neighborhood wind down the way it does. I spent the better part of 4 decades preparing, working towards something, getting ready for the life I was going to live once everything was in order. And all that time, life was already happening. It was happening in the years I was too tired to notice. It was happening in the evenings I spent at the kitchen table, worrying about money instead of being with Carol. It was happening in the phone calls I cut short because I had something else to deal with. I can't get any of that back. That's just the truth, and I've made my peace with it. But I'm here now, and here, sitting on this porch in General Santos, watching the kids from the building chase each other around the courtyard, smelling whatever my neighbor is cooking tonight, listening to the city do what it does at the end of another ordinary day. Here feels like enough. More than enough, actually. And that's the thing nobody told me when I was making my list of all the reasons this was a bad idea. They talked about the risks of going. Nobody talked about what it would feel like to finally stop waiting to arrive.